Street boy comforts crying woman, and she discovers he's her long-lost son. Emily Thompson was crying inconsolably on the steps of the Central Square in Aspen, her hands covering her face as she tried to process the devastating news she had just received. The Hope Community Center, where her son Ethan had last been seen 3 years ago, was set to be demolished the following week. That's when she felt a gentle touch on her arm. Raising her tear-filled eyes, she saw a boy of about 5, with messy brown hair and a worn but clean brown t-shirt. The boy held out a crumpled napkin that looked like it had come from a nearby diner. "Are you sad?" the boy asked in a sweet voice, offering her the napkin. Emily was moved by the child's kindness. She accepted the napkin and wiped her tears, studying the boy's angelic face. There was something familiar about those big, expressive brown eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're very kind," she said, forcing a smile. "My grandma Margaret always says when someone's crying we should help," the boy replied, sitting beside her on the steps. At that moment, Emily noticed a small birthmark on the boy's neck, a crescent-shaped mark. Her heart raced. Ethan had the exact same mark in the same spot. The resemblance was unsettling, but she tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Mason," the boy answered, swinging his legs, which didn't reach the ground. "And you?" "Emily. Do you live nearby, Mason?" The boy pointed to a row of modest houses across the square. "Over there with Grandma Margaret. She's taken care of me since I was really little." Emily's throat tightened. Mason looked about the age Ethan would be now. The same birthmark, the same hair color, even the same way he tilted his head when he spoke. But it couldn't be. Ethan had disappeared during a trip with his father, Robert, who never returned. "Have you always lived here in Aspen?" she pressed, trying to sound casual. "I think so," Mason said, scratching his head. "But sometimes I dream about different places. Grandma says it's because I have a big imagination." A gray-haired woman in a flowered apron approached, breathless. "Mason, I've been looking everywhere for you. You can't just run off like that," she scolded, though her voice was warm. "Sorry, Grandma Margaret. I saw the lady crying and wanted to help," Mason explained, hugging her leg. Margaret studied Emily with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Good afternoon. I hope Mason wasn't bothering you." "Not at all. He was very sweet," Emily said, standing and extending her hand. "I'm Emily." "Margaret Wilson," the woman replied, shaking her hand briefly. "Mason, let's go. Your soup is getting cold." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now back to the story. As she watched Mason walk away hand in hand with Margaret, Emily felt a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. That child had awakened something deep in her maternal heart, something she hadn't felt since Ethan's disappearance. But was she just projecting her grief and longing onto an innocent boy? In the days that followed, Emily found herself returning to that square every day. She worked as a kindergarten teacher at the local school and always found an excuse to pass by during lunch or in the evening. Mason often appeared, playing alone or helping Margaret with small chores. One afternoon, she brought homemade cookies she had baked for her students. When she saw Mason sitting alone on the bench in the central square, she approached. "Hi, Mason, remember me?" The boy smiled widely. "Of course. You're Emily, the lady who was sad." "That's right. I brought some cookies. Want to try one?" Mason looked hesitant for a moment, as if remembering some advice about not accepting food from strangers, but after a few seconds he took a cookie. "It's delicious," he exclaimed, his mouth full of crumbs. "It tastes like the ones I sometimes dream about." "What do you mean you dream about them?" "I dream that a pretty lady makes cookies for me, and she sings a song really softly." Mason stopped chewing, his expression distant. "But Grandma Margaret says they're just silly dreams." Emily's heart raced. She used to make oatmeal cookies for Ethan and always sang Little Fish while cooking. It was their little ritual in the kitchen. "Do you remember the song?" Mason shook his head. "I just remember it's about a fish that can't live. It's sad but pretty." Tears threatened to fill Emily's eyes again. Little Fish was Ethan's favorite song. She used to sing it to him at bedtime, especially after Robert started working late and was rarely home for story time. "Mason, can I ask you something? Do you remember when you were very little before you lived with Grandma Margaret?" The boy grew thoughtful for a long moment. "Sometimes I remember a place with lots of plants and a man who carried me on his back. But Grandma says I was too young and that baby memories aren't reliable." Emily felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. Robert loved taking Ethan to the botanical garden in the town where they lived before, in Boulder. He always carried the boy on his back along the paths between the trees. "And do you remember that man? What was he like?" "He was tall and had a beard that tickled when he kissed me," Mason said with a nostalgic smile. "But Grandma says it might have been my dad before he left." "Left for where?" "I don't know. Grandma never talks much about it." Margaret appeared as if out of nowhere, her expression far from friendly. "Mason, I've told you not to talk to strangers about our family," she scolded, pulling the boy by the hand. "But she's not a stranger, Grandma. It's Emily, she's nice," Mason protested. "I'm sorry, Ma'am," Emily said quickly, standing up. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, I just offered him some cookies." Margaret stared at her coldly. "That's very kind of you, but Mason has a schedule to keep. Come along, dear." Emily watched them walk away, noticing how Margaret held Mason's hand tighter than necessary. There was something in the woman's posture that seemed defensive, as if she were protecting Mason from some threat. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, replaying every detail of her conversation with Mason. The birthmark, his age, the fragmented memories, the song. Everything pointed to a possibility she barely dared consider. But how could it be possible? Robert had taken Ethan for a weekend trip to his grandparents' house in North Carolina. They never returned, and all attempts to contact them failed. The police had investigated for months but found nothing. Robert had quit his job abruptly before the trip, emptied their shared bank account, and simply vanished with Ethan. Emily had imagined they might be living in another country, maybe Canada or Costa Rica, places Robert had always said he'd like to start over. The next day, Emily decided to do some discreet research on Margaret Wilson. She used the school computers during lunch and discovered the woman had lived in Aspen for over 20 years, working as a cleaner for several homes in the area. She couldn't find any information about Mason in official records, which was strange for a 5-year-old boy. She decided to approach Margaret directly. She waited in the central square until the woman appeared to pick up Mason, who was playing with other children near the fountain. "Mrs. Wilson, could I speak with you for a moment?" The woman eyed her suspiciously. "About what?" "About Mason. I'm a teacher, and I care about the children in this area. I noticed he doesn't attend the local school." "Mason studies at home with me. I don't see the need for school yet," Margaret replied curtly. "I understand. And his parents? Do they agree with this decision?" Margaret's face hardened. "Mason's parents are no longer with us. I'm his legal guardian." "I'm so sorry for your loss. May I ask what happened?" "It was an accident," Margaret answered quickly, avoiding Emily's gaze. "I don't like talking about it in front of the child." Emily sensed the woman was lying. Her eyes kept darting away, and her hands trembled slightly. There was something Margaret wasn't telling her. "Mrs. Wilson, perhaps I can help. I've worked with children for many years, and I know how hard it is to raise a child alone, especially under difficult circumstances." "I don't need help," Margaret snapped, but her voice wavered. Mason ran up to them, interrupting the conversation. "Grandma, can I stay a little longer?" Jack brought a new ball. "No, Mason. We need to go home." Margaret took the boy's hand firmly. "But, Grandma..." No arguing. Emily saw the disappointment on Mason's face and felt a pang in her heart. She remembered how upset Ethan used to get when she had to cut his playtime short because of errands. "Mason, if your grandmother allows it, you can come to my house sometime. I have some educational games you might like," Emily offered. Margaret pulled Mason away before he could respond. "That won't be necessary. Good afternoon." Emily watched the two figures walk away, feeling she had missed an important opportunity. She needed to find a way to earn Margaret's trust, and more importantly, uncover the truth about Mason's origins. That week, Emily changed her strategy. Instead of confronting Margaret directly, she decided to become a subtle presence in their routine. She discovered that every Wednesday morning, Margaret and Mason went to the farmer's market. Emily began doing her shopping at the same time. During their first chance meeting, she simply waved from a distance. The second time, she helped Margaret carry her bags to the bus stop. The third time, she offered a ride, which was declined, but less harshly. Mason was always happy to see her, and Emily used these moments to observe him more closely. The boy had the same habit as Ethan of biting his lower lip when concentrating. He also rubbed his eyes with the backs of his hands when tired, just like Ethan used to. During one of these observations, Emily noticed Mason wore a small leather bracelet on his right wrist. Her heart nearly stopped. It was identical to one she had made for Ethan on the last Children's Day they spent together. Robert had praised her handiwork and promised to teach Ethan how to make his own bracelets when he was older. "Mason, what a lovely bracelet," she remarked, trying to sound casual. The boy looked at his wrist as if he'd forgotten he was wearing it. "Oh, this. Grandma says I already had it when I came to live with her. Do you like it?" "Yeah. Sometimes it gets warm like it's magic," Mason said with an innocent smile. Margaret, who had stepped away to pick out vegetables, returned just then and saw Emily talking to Mason. Her expression instantly turned wary. "Mason, come here," she called with authority. "Grandma doesn't like it when I talk about the bracelet," Mason whispered to Emily before walking away. That revelation confirmed Emily's growing suspicions. The bracelet, the fragmented memories, the birthmark, his age, the physical resemblance. Everything pointed to a conclusion almost too impossible to believe. Mason was Ethan. But how could that be? And what was Margaret's role in all this? Was she Robert's accomplice? Or had she been deceived too? Emily decided she needed professional help. The next day, she went to see Dr. Howard Mitchell, a family law attorney who had assisted her during the search for Ethan after his disappearance. "Emily, it's been a while," Dr. Howard greeted her in his office. "How have you been holding up?" "Actually, Dr. Howard, I think I've found Ethan." The attorney nearly spilled his coffee. "What do you mean? Where?" Emily recounted the entire story, starting from their first encounter in the central square. Dr. Howard listened carefully, taking occasional notes. "Emily, I understand your desire to find Ethan, but we must be very cautious. The evidence you've described is circumstantial. The birthmark is significant, but legally it's not enough. But what about his memories, the bracelet, the song? They could be coincidences, or you might be unconsciously influencing the child's responses. I've seen cases like this before." Dr. Howard paused. "I'm not saying you're wrong, but we need concrete proof." "What do you suggest?" "First, a discreet investigation into Margaret Wilson and her relationship with the child. Second, if possible, a DNA test. But for that, we'd need her cooperation or a court order. And how could we get a court order? With enough evidence that the child might be unlawfully kept, but it's a complicated and lengthy process." Emily left the office with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was relieved to have a plan. On the other, the prospect of a long legal battle terrified her. What if Margaret discovered her intentions and fled with Mason? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. In the following days, Emily discreetly hired a private investigator recommended by Dr. Howard. Charles Martin was a middle-aged man, a former police officer specializing in missing persons cases. "I need you to find out everything about Margaret Wilson and how she gained custody of Mason," Emily explained during their first meeting. "Understood. I'll check official records, talk to neighbors, review financial history, but this might take a few weeks. Is it a problem if I keep in touch with them? I'm afraid if I distance myself completely, they might suspect something and run. On the contrary, maintain your routine but be discreet. If this woman really has something to hide, any sudden change in behavior could alert her." The next few days were an emotional roller coaster for Emily. During class, she tried to focus on her students, but often caught herself comparing each child to her memories of Ethan. In the afternoons, she went to the square, trying to appear casual as she watched Mason play. Unaware of the tension around him, Mason remained a normal child, chasing pigeons, playing hide-and-seek with other kids, and always greeting Emily with a bright smile when he saw her. One afternoon, as Mason played in the park, Emily approached Margaret, who was sitting on a bench knitting. "That's beautiful work," she commented, sitting beside the woman. "Thank you," Margaret answered, without looking up from her needlework. "It's for winter. Mason grows so fast. I imagine it must be challenging raising him alone." Margaret paused for a moment. "Sometimes, but he's a very good boy. The two of you are very close. Is he your biological grandson?" The question made Margaret miss a stitch. She looked at Emily with a strange expression. "Why do you ask?" "Just curiosity. He looks a lot like me when I was a child. Same hair color, same eyes." "Mason looks like a lot of people," Margaret replied quickly. "He has a common face. And his parents. Did you know them well?" Margaret abruptly put her knitting back in her bag. "I don't like talking about that. It's too painful." "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you." "Mason," Margaret called. "Time to go home." Emily noticed Margaret's hands trembling slightly as she gathered her things. There was definitely something the woman was hiding. That night, Charles Martin called Emily with the first findings. "I've found some interesting inconsistencies," he said. "Margaret Wilson has indeed lived in Aspen for 20 years, but there are no official records of Mason as her dependent until 2 years ago." "What does that mean?" "It means during the first year she supposedly cared for him, there was no legal record of custody. I also found out she receives a small monthly deposit in her bank account, always from an anonymous transfer." Emily's heart raced. "Do you think someone is paying her to take care of Mason?" "It's a possibility. I also spoke with some longtime neighbors. They all agree Mason appeared suddenly about 3 years ago, and Margaret has always been vague about the circumstances." "Did you find out anything about his parents?" "That's where it gets interesting. One neighbor said Margaret told different versions of the story. First, she said the parents died in a car accident. Then she said the mother had issues with drinking, and the father ran away. Stories that don't add up." Emily felt a mix of hope and unease. The evidence was mounting, but it still wasn't enough for legal action. "What do we do now?" "Keep observing and documenting everything. I'm trying to trace the source of the bank transfers. If I can prove someone is paying Margaret to keep the child, we'll have evidence of something irregular." In the following days, Emily intensified her observations. She began noting every detail of Mason's behavior, every memory he mentioned, every reaction from Margaret. One rainy afternoon, Mason took shelter under the small awning of the public library, where Emily was waiting for the bus. Margaret had gone to the post office and told him to wait there. "Hi, Aunt Emily," Mason said, using an affectionate term for the first time. "Hi, sweetheart. Are you alone?" "Grandma went to pick up a package. She told me to stay here." Mason sat beside her on the bench. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you always look sad when you see me?" The question caught Emily off guard. She hadn't realized her emotions were so transparent to a child. "You remind me of someone very special I once knew," she answered carefully. "Someone who isn't here anymore?" "Exactly." Mason grew thoughtful for a moment. "I also feel like I've met you before. Isn't that strange?" Emily's heart nearly stopped. "What do you mean, Mason?" "Sometimes when you smile, I remember a good feeling, like being at home. But Grandma says that's silly." "And you? Do you feel at home here in Aspen?" Mason shook his head slowly. "Sometimes I dream of another place, a house with a big garden and a woman who used to sing to me. But when I wake up, Grandma says they were just dreams. Do you remember anything specific about this woman from your dreams? She had hair like yours, and she made cookies that smelled just like the ones you brought the other day." Mason paused. "Aunt Emily, do you think people can forget their real families?" The question felt like a knife to Emily's heart. She had to force herself to stay composed. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because sometimes I feel like I'm forgetting something really important. Like there are people I should remember, but I can't." Margaret appeared at that moment, her expression alarmed when she saw Mason talking so seriously with Emily. "Mason, I told you not to bother people," she scolded. "He's not bothering me." Emily stood up. "We were just talking about the rain." Margaret took Mason's hand more tightly than necessary. "We're going home now." "Grandma, you're hurting my hand," Mason protested. "Sorry, sweetheart." Margaret loosened her grip, but didn't let go. Emily watched them walk away and noticed Mason looking back several times, as if he wanted to continue the conversation. That night, she called Charles Martin and recounted her talk with Mason. "His memories are very specific," the investigator noted. "A 5-year-old wouldn't make up details like the smell of cookies or the feeling of being at home. That usually comes from real experiences." "So you think Mason really is Ethan?" "The evidence points that way. But we still need to figure out how he ended up with Margaret and what the connection is to Robert." "Any updates on the bank transfers?" "I'm getting close. The money comes from an account in Chicago, registered under a consulting firm that seems like a front. I'm looking into the partners." "How long will that take?" "A few more days, but Emily, I need to warn you. If Mason really is Ethan and if Margaret is involved in something illegal, she might try to run if she realizes she's being investigated." The warning left Emily deeply anxious. She decided to step up her presence in Mason and Margaret's routine, even if it risked raising suspicions. Better that than losing Mason again. The next day, she offered to help Margaret with groceries. To her surprise, the woman agreed. "You've been very kind to us," Margaret said, as they walked through the market. "Mason really likes you. He's a special boy, so smart and sensitive." "Sometimes too smart," Margaret murmured almost to herself. "What do you mean?" "Nothing, just... He asks a lot of hard questions. About the past, about family. It's complicated for a boy his age." Emily saw an opening. "It must be. Especially considering how you two came together." Margaret stopped in the middle of the cleaning aisle. "What do you mean?" "Well, taking in a child after losing his parents is a huge challenge. You were very brave to take on that responsibility." "I didn't have a choice," Margaret replied, her voice heavy with sadness. "When someone leaves a child with you and disappears, what do you do? Leave them on the street?" Emily's heart raced. This was the first time Margaret had admitted Mason hadn't come to her through normal means. "Someone left Mason with you?" Margaret realized she'd said too much. Her eyes widened, and she began pushing the cart faster. "No, I meant... after his parents' accident. It was complicated." "Margaret, if someone left Mason with you the wrong way, you're not to blame. We can fix this together." "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret answered, but her voice trembled. Mason, who had wandered off to look at some cheap toys at the end of the aisle, came running back. "Grandma, can I get this truck?" He showed a small plastic toy truck. "We don't have money for toys," Margaret replied automatically. "I can buy it for him," offered Emily. "No." Margaret's response was sharper than she intended. "I mean, it's not necessary. Mason has enough toys at home." Mason looked confused between the two women, clearly sensing the tension in the air. "It's okay, sweetheart." Emily knelt down to his level. "Maybe another time." "Okay," Mason replied, but disappointment tinged his voice. The rest of the shopping passed in tense silence. Margaret avoided Emily's gaze and kept Mason close to her. When they left the store, Emily tried one last approach. "Margaret, if you need help with anything, you can count on me. Sometimes talking about our problems can be a relief." Margaret stopped and looked directly at Emily for the first time that afternoon. "For you seem like a good person, Emily, but there are things in life that are too complicated for strangers to understand. I just ask that you respect our privacy." "Of course. But if you ever change your mind..." "I won't," Margaret interrupted. "Come on, Mason." Emily watched the two figures walk away, feeling she had come close to a confession, but had ended up scaring Margaret. That night, Charles Martin called with important news. "I found out who's behind the bank transfers," he said bluntly. "It's Robert Smith Foster." Emily felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. "Robert? But how? He's alive and apparently working under a false identity in Chicago. The consulting firm is registered under a fake partner, but all financial trails lead back to him. Does this mean he really took Ethan and left him with Margaret? It seems so, and judging by the monthly transfer amounts, he's paying her well to keep the boy. But why? Why would Robert do this? Robert do. And why didn't he take Ethan out of the country like we thought? Those are the questions we need to answer, but now we have enough evidence for legal action. Emily was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Robert was alive. Ethan was in Aspen. Everything she had imagined about them being in another country was wrong. What do we do now? Tomorrow, we'll talk to Dr. Howard and come up with a strategy. With this evidence, we can get a search warrant, or at least force an official investigation. What if Margaret runs away with Mason before then? That's why we need to act fast. But we also have to be careful not to traumatize the child more than necessary. Emily spent the whole night awake, swinging between euphoria and anxiety. Finally, there was concrete evidence that Mason was Ethan. But now what? How to deal with the fact that Robert had deliberately separated Ethan from her? And what would the psychological impact be on Ethan when he discovered his whole life had been a lie? The next day, while teaching, Emily received an emergency call from the school principal. "Emily, there's a woman here asking for you. She says it's urgent." Emily rushed to the office and found Margaret waiting with Mason by her side. The woman looked extremely distraught. "I need to talk to you," Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "Of course. We can use the teacher's lounge." "Can Mason stay in the office?" Margaret glanced at the boy. "It won't take long." The secretary offered Mason some coloring books, and he obediently sat in a chair in the corner of the room. In the teacher's lounge, Margaret broke down. "I can't take it anymore," she sobbed. "It's been 3 years since I've carried this guilt." Emily sat beside her, her heart racing. "What guilt, Margaret?" "Mason. He's not my grandson. He never was." "I know," Emily said softly. "Can you tell me what really happened?" Margaret looked at her in surprise. "You know?" "I've suspected for a few weeks. Mason is my son Ethan, isn't he?" Margaret nodded, crying harder. "How did you figure it out?" "The birthmark, his memories, so many little details. And today, I confirmed that Robert is alive and sending you money." "You investigated?" "I had to. Ethan disappeared 3 years ago, and I never stopped looking for him." Margaret wiped her tears and took a deep breath. "I need to tell you everything. You deserve to know the truth." Emily held her breath, finally about to learn what had really happened to her son. "Robert showed up at my door 3 years ago, in the middle of the night, holding Ethan. The child was asleep, and Robert seemed desperate. He said he was running from serious financial trouble and couldn't take care of the boy." "What kind of trouble?" "He said he'd gotten involved with dangerous people, loans he couldn't repay. That if he kept Ethan, they'd both be in danger." Emily felt anger and confusion at once. "And you just agreed to take a stranger's child?" "Robert wasn't exactly a stranger. He'd done some gardening work for me years before, when he was still married to you. I remembered him as an honest man, just going through a rough patch. But you didn't question his story." "I did. I asked why he didn't leave Ethan with you, his mother. That's when he told a terrible lie." "What lie?" Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "He said you'd developed serious problems with alcohol and drugs after the split, that you weren't fit to care for a child, and that social services were investigating." Emily was stunned. "And you believed him?" "At the time, yes. Robert seemed sincere and he was clearly desperate. He offered to pay me a sizable monthly amount to care for Ethan temporarily until he could sort out his problems." "Temporarily. 3 years later, he still hasn't sorted anything." "That's the thing," Margaret leaned forward. "These past few months I've been pressing Robert to resolve Ethan's situation. The boy is growing up asking hard questions about family. He has a right to know his real story." "And what does Robert say?" "He always has excuses, says it's still not safe, that he needs more time. But I've started suspecting he's lying about a lot of things." "Why didn't you go to the authorities before?" "Robert convinced me it would be dangerous for Ethan. Said if I involved the police, the people after him might find out where Ethan was hidden. Emily realized how skillfully Robert had manipulated Margaret, using fear to keep her silent. And now, why tell me the truth today? Because last night, Ethan had a terrible nightmare. He woke up crying, calling for Mommy. When I tried to comfort him, he said he dreamed of a woman with brown hair singing to him. He described you perfectly. Tears streamed down Emily's face. He remembered me. And more than that, when he woke up, he asked me point blank if I was really his grandmother. Said for weeks he's felt like he knows me from somewhere else, not as family. What did you say? I lied again. But looking at that innocent boy, I realized I can't keep being part of this charade. Ethan deserves to know his real mother. Emily stood abruptly and began pacing the room. 3 years of suffering, 3 years searching for Ethan all over the world, and he was just a few hours away from home. Margaret, do you understand that what Robert did was kidnapping, and that you, even unintentionally, were an accomplice? I understand. Margaret lowered her head. I'm ready to face the consequences. I just want Ethan to be returned to you. And Robert, are you willing to testify against him? Yes. He lied to me, manipulated my good intentions, and took a child away from his mother. That's unforgivable. Emily stopped walking and looked at Margaret. Despite all the anger she felt, she also recognized that the woman had been a victim of Robert's manipulation. What do we do now? Ethan still thinks you're his grandmother. How do we explain the situation to him without traumatizing him? I've been thinking about that. Margaret stood up. Ethan is smart and sensitive. I think we can tell him the truth gradually, in a way he can process. And are you willing to lose Ethan? Because even if you were deceived, 3 years is a long time. He must love you as his grandmother. Of course I'll miss him terribly. Margaret wiped more tears. But true love sometimes means making sacrifices. Ethan belongs with you, his real family. At that moment, the living room door opened and Mason peeked in. Grandma, can I come in? I'm worried because you're crying. Emily and Margaret exchanged glances. It was time for the truth. Come in, sweetheart, Margaret said. We have something important to talk to you about. Mason entered the room and immediately ran to hug Margaret. Are you okay, Grandma? I am Mason, but I need to tell you some important things about our family. Mason looked between Margaret and Emily, his expression showing he sensed the seriousness of the situation. It's about my dreams, isn't it? He asked, surprising both women. Why do you ask that, sweetheart? Because lately I dream a lot about Aunt Emily, and in the dreams, she's not my aunt. She's different. Emily knelt to Mason's level, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Mason, would you like to know what's different in your dreams? The boy nodded, his big eyes fixed on Emily's face. In the dreams, you're my mommy, he said softly. The world seemed to stop. Emily reached out her hands, and Mason, without hesitation, stepped closer to her. What if I told you your dreams are right? Emily whispered. Mason looked at her, then at Margaret, then back at Emily. Are you really my mommy? Yes, my love. I'm your mommy who's been looking for you for a very, very long time. Mason threw himself into Emily's arms, and she held him as if she'd never let go. 3 years of longing, 3 years of pain, 3 years of relentless searching culminated in that embrace. I knew it, Mason murmured against her shoulder. I knew you were special. That's why I always felt good around you. Margaret watched the scene with tears in her eyes, a mix of happiness and sadness on her face. And Grandma Margaret? Mason asked, still in Emily's arms. Isn't she my real grandma? Grandma Margaret took such good care of you when your mommy couldn't, Emily explained gently. She loved you like a real grandson. That will never change. But now I can stay with you, Mommy. Yes, my love, but we have to sort out a few things first, and Grandma Margaret will always be part of our lives if you want. Mason looked at Margaret. I do want that. Grandma is my family too now. Margaret began to cry again, but now they were tears of relief. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The following days were an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. Dr. Howard Mitchell worked quickly to formalize the legal situation, while Charles Martin continued tracking Robert. Emily Thompson decided that Ethan, he chose to keep the name Mason as he'd grown used to it, would stay with her during the day and continue sleeping with Margaret for a few weeks to ease the transition. "I don't want it to be traumatic for him," Emily explained to Dr. Mitchell. 3 years is a long time in a child's life. Margaret is the only stability he's ever known. "That's a wise approach," the lawyer agreed. "And legally we need Margaret's full cooperation to build the case against Robert." One afternoon, while Mason played on the playground at the school where Emily worked, she decided it was time to explain more about what had happened. "Mason, do you remember the man who sometimes appears in your dreams? The one who used to take you for walks?" "Yeah, I remember. He had a beard and put me on his shoulders." "That man is your dad, Robert. He did some wrong things 3 years ago." "What wrong things?" Emily took a deep breath. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his father had kidnapped him? "Your dad was going through a hard time and thought it would be better for you to stay with Grandma Margaret for a while, but he forgot to tell me where you were. That's why I was so worried and looked for you all this time." "Did Dad make you sad?" "Yes, very sad. But now I'm happy because I found you." Mason was thoughtful for a moment. "Is Dad coming back?" "We don't know. Maybe he'll come talk to us when he finds out we're together. I want to see Dad, but I want to stay with you and Grandma Margaret." "And that's exactly what's going to happen, sweetheart." That night, Charles Martin called with a troubling update. "Robert found out we're investigating. Someone tipped him off and he stopped sending money to Margaret." "Does that mean he might try to take Mason back?" "It's possible. I also found out more about his financial troubles. Apparently, he really did get involved with loan sharks and owes a significant amount." "Do you think the story about dangerous people is true?" "Part of it, yes. But that doesn't excuse what he did to Mason, and it certainly doesn't excuse lying to Margaret about you having drug problems." "What now?" "Dr. Mitchell is speeding up the process to formalize your temporary custody of Mason. We're also preparing an arrest warrant for Robert on kidnapping charges." "Is Margaret safe?" "For now, yes. But it would be wise for you to stay together for the next few days." Emily decided Mason would stay at her house that night, with Margaret too. She set up the guest room for the older woman and made an extra bed in her own room for Mason. "Mum, do you have pictures of me when I was a baby?" Mason asked as she helped him brush his teeth. "Yes, lots of pictures." "Want to see?" Mason's eyes lit up. "Yeah." Emily went to get the photo album she'd carefully kept all these years. They sat on the bed and began flipping through the pages. "This is you 1 day old." She showed him the first photo. "I was so tiny." Mason laughed. "And this one?" "You at 3 months, trying to hold your first pacifier." "What about this?" He pointed to a photo of him playing in a garden. "You at 1.5 years at the playground near our old house. You loved the slide." Mason studied the photo closely. "I remember this place. I've dreamed about it lots of times. We'll visit there someday when everything settles down." "What about Dad? Is he in the pictures?" Emily hesitated. There were many photos of Robert with Ethan, especially from the boys' early years. She decided to show a few. "This is you and your dad Robert on your 2nd birthday." Mason stared intently at the photo. "He looks different, happier." "Yes, back then, we were a happy family." "What happened to make us stop being happy?" It was too complicated a question for a 5-year-old. Emily decided to simplify. "Sometimes adults have problems that are hard to solve, and that can change families. But what matters is that you were always loved, even when we were apart." Mason snuggled closer to her. "I always felt like there was someone who loved me, even when I didn't know who it was. Now I know it was you." Emily kissed the top of her son's head, feeling a peace she hadn't known in 3 years. The next day, while Emily was at school and Mason played in the office, she didn't want him out of her sight, Margaret received an unexpected call. "Margaret, it's Robert." The woman nearly dropped the phone. "Robert, where are you?" "That doesn't matter. I heard you've been talking to people about Mason." "Yes, I have. because it's time he knew the truth about his family. Margaret, you don't understand the situation. There are still dangerous people looking for me. If Mason goes to live with Emily, they might find out where he is. Robert, enough with the lies. I know you lied about Emily having drug problems. I've met her, and she's a wonderful woman. Silence filled the other end of the line. How did you meet her? She's been searching for Mason for 3 years. She showed up here in Aspen and recognized her own son. Margaret, I need you to bring Mason to a location I'll give you. Today. I won't do that, Robert. Mason has found his mother again. That's where he belongs. If you don't bring Mason, I'll come get him myself, and this time we'll disappear forever. The call ended, leaving Margaret terrified. She immediately called Emily. Robert just called me. He's threatening to take Mason away if I don't hand him over today. Emily felt her blood run cold. Where are you? At school, in the office with Mason. Stay there. I'll call Charles Martin and Dr. Howard. Don't leave for any reason. Emily cancelled her classes and locked herself in the teacher's lounge with Margaret and Mason, calling everyone who could help. The police are on their way, Charles Martin said over the phone. Dr. Howard managed to expedite the arrest warrant. If Robert shows up, he'll be arrested immediately. And if he doesn't, if he just runs and gives up on Mason? That would be the best-case scenario for you. But knowing men like Robert, he probably won't give up easily. As if summoned by the conversation, Margaret's phone rang again. It was Robert. Put it on speaker, Emily instructed. Robert, Margaret answered. Margaret, I've changed my mind. I'm coming to get Mason at the school. I'm on my way. Robert, the police are coming. If you show up here, you'll be arrested. What police? Who called the police? Emily. She's Mason's mother and has full legal rights to him. Emily doesn't understand the dangers involved. There are still people who want to hurt me, and they might use Mason to get to me. Emily took the phone from Margaret's hands. Robert, it's me, Emily. Emily. His voice softened. How did you find us? I looked for Mason for 3 years, Robert. 3 years? How could you do this to me? How could you separate a mother from her son? You don't understand. I was protecting both of you. Protecting? Lying about me having drug problems. Making our son think I didn't exist anymore? Things got out of hand. It was only supposed to be temporary. Robert, come here and let's talk like adults about this story of dangerous people, about your financial troubles, about Mason's future. But come ready to tell the truth. Are you going to hand Mason over to me? I'll do what's best for our son, but he'll know I'm his mother and you won't keep him from me anymore. I'm on my way, but if there's police, I'll run and you'll never see me again. Robert, your son needs stability. He needs a real family. Stop running and let's solve this together. The call dropped again. Emily looked at Mason, who had heard the whole conversation with wide eyes. Mommy, is Daddy mad? No, sweetheart. Daddy's confused and scared, but we'll help him feel better. Is he gonna take me away? I won't let that happen. Emily hugged him tightly. We'll never be apart again. 20 minutes later, Robert appeared at the school gate. Emily saw him through the office window. He was thinner, with longer hair and an unshaven beard. He looked exhausted and nervous. Margaret, take Mason to the teacher's lounge, Emily instructed. I'll talk to Robert first. Are you sure? Yes. He's Mason's father, not a dangerous stranger. But I need to understand what really happened before they reunite. Emily stepped outside and walked toward Robert, who stood near the gate. Hi, Robert. Emily, you look well? I am. Now, after 3 years of hell searching for my son. Robert lowered his head. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Then, explain it to me. What really happened? The whole truth. Robert took a deep breath and began to speak. The story he told was different from what he'd told Margaret, but still full of omissions and half-truths. He had indeed gotten involved with loan sharks, but not because the family needed money. He'd started gambling compulsively online and in underground casinos. Within months, he'd racked up a massive debt. When those guys started threatening you and Ethan, I panicked, he explained. I thought if I disappeared with Ethan, you'd be safe. But why didn't you tell me? We could have figured it out together. I was ashamed, and I was afraid you'd never forgive me for what I did to our savings. Robert, you spent our savings. All of it. The house was about to be foreclosed. That's why I planned that weekend trip. I was going to leave Ethan with my parents and disappear alone. But when we got there, they weren't home. They'd gone on a trip and I didn't know. And then, I panicked. I couldn't take Ethan home because the loan sharks could show up any time. I couldn't leave him alone. Then I remembered Margaret, who'd always been so kind to us. So you made up that story about me having drug problems to convince her to take Ethan. Yes, Robert admitted, tears in his eyes. It was the most cowardly thing I've ever done. And these past 3 years? Why didn't you ever try to fix things? I did, Emily, I really tried. I got a job in Chicago, paid off some of the debt. But every time I thought of coming back, I was too scared to face what I'd done. And Ethan, did you ever think about how much he was suffering, not understanding why his mother vanished from his life? Robert began to cry. I thought about it every day, but I was afraid that if I brought Ethan back, the money problems would return, and I'd end up hurting you both again. Emily looked at the man she once loved, now broken by the weight of his own choices. She felt anger, but also an odd compassion. Robert, do you understand what you did was a crime, that you could go to jail for kidnapping? I know, and I'm ready to face the consequences. I just want to make sure Ethan will be okay. Ethan is okay. He remembers you fondly, but he remembers me too. And he wants a stable family, not more running and lies. Can I see him? Emily hesitated. You can, but under some conditions. What are they? First, you'll turn yourself into the police and fully cooperate with the investigation. Second, you'll undergo treatment for your gambling addiction. Third, when you get out of prison, you'll only see Ethan in supervised visits until you prove you've truly changed. Robert nodded. I accept all the conditions. I just want Ethan to know I never stopped loving him. He knows, and I'll make sure he keeps knowing, even after everything that happened. Emily led Robert inside the school. Mason was in the teacher's lounge with Margaret, drawing on a sheet of paper. Mason, Emily called softly. There's someone here who wants to see you. Mason looked up and saw Robert standing at the door. For a moment he froze. Then a slow smile spread across his face. Daddy! He ran into Robert's arms. Robert hugged him as if it were the last time, crying without shame. Hi, champ. Look how big you've gotten. Daddy, why did you leave? I missed you. Daddy had to take care of some very complicated problems, but I'm here now. Are you staying? Mom Emily said we're going to be a family again. Robert looked at Emily over Mason's head. Yes, son, but maybe in a slightly different way than before. Different how? Well, you'll live with Mom Emily and I'll live somewhere else for a while, but we'll see each other all the time. Why? Don't you love Mom anymore? Robert and Emily exchanged glances. How do you explain separation, betrayal, and legal consequences to a 5-year-old? Mason, Emily knelt beside them. Sometimes when grown-ups make very big mistakes, they need time to learn how to be better people before they can live as a family again. Did Daddy make mistakes? Yes, he did. But what matters most is that he's willing to fix them. Mason looked between his parents, then hugged both Robert and Emily at the same time. I love you both. I don't want you to fight. We won't fight, I promise, said Emily. We'll work together to take care of you the best we can. Robert spent another hour playing with Mason before the police arrived. When the officers appeared, he kissed his son on the forehead and whispered, Be a good boy for your mum. Daddy will be back soon. Promise? I promise. Robert turned himself in voluntarily, fully cooperating with the authorities. Dr. Howard had previously negotiated for him to be charged with child abandonment instead of kidnapping, resulting in a lighter sentence. In the following months, Emily and Mason settled into a new routine. Mason continued visiting Margaret every week, maintaining the bond he'd developed with her. Margaret in turn became a grandmother-like figure, helping Emily with occasional childcare and providing the emotional stability Mason needed. Mason started attending a school in Aspen, where Emily had secured a transfer. The boy adjusted well, made new friends easily, and never showed signs of significant trauma from what he'd been through. Robert served 6 months in prison and another 6 on probation. During that time, he underwent intensive treatment for gambling addiction and psychological therapy. When he was finally cleared for supervised visits with Mason, he was a changed man. The first visits were tense. Mason had grown and changed during Robert's absence, and their father-son relationship had to be rebuilt gradually. But with patience and consistency, they managed to re-establish their bond. 1 year after their reunion, Emily, Mason, Robert, and Margaret gathered in the same central square where it had all begun. It was Mason's 6th birthday, and they had decided to celebrate together. "Mom, are you happy?" Mason asked while eating his slice of cake. "Very happy, sweetheart." "Why?" "Because you don't cry anymore when you think about me." Emily smiled, hugging her son. She really didn't cry anymore. The pain of separation had been replaced by the joy of their rebuilt family, even if it looked different from before. "You know what makes me happiest," she said. "What?" "Knowing that no matter what happens in the future, we'll always be a family. Maybe not a family that all lives in the same house, but a family that loves and cares for each other." Mason looked around the table, watching Emily, Robert, and Margaret talking and laughing together. "It's true, we're a big family now." Robert, who had overheard the conversation, leaned toward Mason. "And you know what Daddy learned this year?" "What?" "That family isn't just about being together physically. It's about being together in our hearts, even when we're in different places." "How?" "Even when Daddy was far away, you and Mommy were still in my heart. And even when I was confused and did wrong things, you still loved me." Mason thought for a moment. "So even when I grow up and live in my own house, we'll still be family?" "Always," Emily and Robert said at the same time. Margaret, who had stayed quiet during the conversation, got emotional. "Mason, can I tell you a secret?" "Sure." "The day I met you and your mum in the square, I knew right away you were special to each other. There was something in the way she looked at you, and the way you acted around her. Even though you didn't know we were mother and son. Even then. True love has its own energy. Sometimes we can feel it even before our minds understand what's happening." Mason smiled. "Like in dreams. I dreamed about Mom before I even knew she was my mom." "Exactly like in dreams." When the party ended and everyone went home, Emily tucked Mason into bed in his room, now decorated with pictures of their whole family, including Margaret and Robert. "Mom, can I ask you a serious question?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Did you forgive Daddy for what he did?" The question caught Emily off guard. It was complicated, something she was still working through. "You know, Mason, forgiving doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't important. Forgiving means choosing not to let anger control our lives. And you chose not to let anger control you?" "Yes, because I realized staying angry at Daddy wouldn't give me back the 3 years we lost. But forgiving him and working together as a family gives us a chance to make many happy years ahead." "Has Daddy forgiven himself too?" Emily was struck by the depth of the question. "That's a very grown-up question, Mason. I think Daddy is still learning to forgive himself. Sometimes it's harder to forgive ourselves than to forgive others." "Can I help him forgive himself?" "You can. By showing him you love him, that you're happy he's trying to be better, and that you believe he can do it." Mason smiled and snuggled under the covers. "Mom?" "Yes?" "Thank you for never stopping to look for me. Thank you for never stopping to remember me, even when you didn't understand why. I think it's because our hearts were connected, even far apart." "I think you're right, sweetheart." 2 years later, Robert had completed his treatment and shown consistent changes in his behavior. The court allowed him to have unsupervised visits with Mason, and occasionally the boy would spend weekends at the house Robert had rented in Chicago. Emily had started a new relationship with a fellow teacher, but always made it clear that Mason was her absolute priority. Her new partner, Charles Edward, proved understanding and patient, gradually building a friendship with Mason. "Mom, can I call Charles Edward my stepdad?" Mason asked one day. "You can if you want, but don't feel obligated." "I want to. He's nice to me and he makes you smile a lot." And what do you think Dad Robert will think? Mason grew thoughtful. I think he'll be happy, because he'll know there are more people looking after me when he can't be around. Mason's emotional maturity often surprised Emily. Having lived through a complex family situation from a young age had given him an unusual ability to understand and accept non-traditional relationships. During one of Robert's visits, he, Emily, and Charles Edward had an open conversation about navigating the situation for Mason's well-being. I won't pretend it's easy to accept another man in my son's life, Robert admitted. But I recognize I lost the right to be jealous when I made the mistakes I did. Robert, I never wanted to replace you, Charles Edward replied. Mason speaks about you with so much affection, and of course you're an important part of his life. I think what matters is that Mason feels he has a strong support system, Emily said. He has 4 adults who love him, me, you, Margaret, and Charles Edward. That's a privilege, not a problem. You're right, Robert smiled for the first time during the conversation. Mason is lucky to have so many people who care about him. That evening, the 4 adults sat down with Mason to explain how their family dynamic would work moving forward. Mason, do you understand that your family is a little different from some of your friends' families? Emily asked. I do. Some of my friends just have a mom and dad. Others only have a mom or only a dad. I have Mom, Dad, Grandma Margaret, and Stepdad Charles Edward. And how do you feel about that? I feel lucky. I have more people to help me when I need it, more people to play with, and more people to give me presents on my birthday, Mason laughed. And if a friend asks why your family is different, I'll explain that family isn't just about living in the same house, it's about loving and caring for each other, and that my family loves me very much, even if we're spread across different homes. Robert was moved by his son's answer. Mason, you know Dad made mistakes that hurt our family, right? I know. And do you forgive me for those mistakes? Mason got up from his chair and hugged Robert. Dad, you'll always be my dad no matter what mistakes you made. And you're trying to be better now. That's what matters. This time it was Emily who was moved. Her 7-year-old son had developed an emotional wisdom that many adults spend a lifetime trying to achieve. 3 years after their reunion, Emily decided to write a book about her experience of losing and finding Ethan. She wanted other families in similar situations to know it was possible to rebuild bonds after trauma and separation. Why do you want to write about our story? Mason asked when she explained the project. Because our story proves that the love between a mother and child is stronger than anything. Even when we were apart, you kept remembering me, and I never stopped searching for you. And do you think our story can help other people? I think so. Especially other mothers who've lost their children and other kids who are far from their real families. Can I help you write? Of course. You can tell me your memories and feelings about everything that happened. The process of writing the book together was therapeutic for both of us. Mason, now 8 years old, could articulate his emotions about the experience in a surprisingly mature way. You know, Mom, I think everything happened the way it was supposed to, he said during one of their writing sessions. Why do you think that? Because if Dad hadn't taken me to Grandma Margaret, I would never have met her, and she's a very special person in my life. That's true. And if you hadn't searched for me so hard, maybe I would never have come home. So even the sad parts of our story led to something good. What a beautiful thought, Mason. And besides, now our family is bigger and more interesting than it was before. We have stories to tell that most people don't. Emily hugged her son, amazed by his ability to find the positive even in painful situations. The book was published 2 years later, titled The Boy Who Remembered Love. It became a regional bestseller and helped many families going through similar struggles. During the book launch, held in the same central square where Emily and Mason had reunited, all the members of their extended family were present. Robert, who now worked as a counselor for people struggling with gambling addiction. Margaret, who had also become a mother figure to Emily. Charles Edward, who proposed to Emily at the end of the event. And Mason, now 10 years old, who read an excerpt from the book to the audience. This story began in this square 5 years ago, Mason said into the microphone. A woman was crying because she thought she had lost her son forever. A boy tried to comfort her, because he thought she was just a stranger who needed help. Neither of them knew they were mother and son. The audience was completely silent. Today, 5 years later, we're a big, happy family. We've learned that true love doesn't depend on living in the same house, or never making mistakes, or having a family that looks like everyone else's. Mason paused and looked at each member of his family. We've learned that true love is about never giving up on each other, about forgiving mistakes, about building bridges when things break, and about choosing to be family every day, even when it's hard. The audience erupted in applause. Emily had tears in her eyes, not of sadness like 5 years before, but of pride and gratitude. After the event, as they were packing up the chairs and materials from the launch, Mason approached Emily. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." "When I grow up and have kids, can I tell them the story of how you found me in the square?" "You can. But why?" "Because I want them to know that no matter what happens in life, love always finds a way back home." Emily hugged Mason, feeling that her journey of pain had completely transformed into one of healing and growth. "You know, Mason, you're right. Love always finds a way back home. And do you know why I'm so sure of that?" "Why?" "Because even when I was very little and didn't understand anything, my heart always knew you were out there looking for me. Love is stronger than distance, stronger than time, and stronger than any mistake people can make." As they walked back home, passing the same steps where it had all begun, Emily reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. The pain of separation had turned into gratitude for their reunion. The anger over betrayal had turned into compassion for human weakness. The fear of never seeing Ethan again had turned into the certainty that some bonds are unbreakable. "Mom," Mason interrupted her thoughts. "Yes? Thank you for teaching me that family is about choice, not just blood. And thank you for choosing our family every day. Thank you for choosing to forgive me for not being able to protect you when you needed me most. Mom, you always protected me. Even when you were far away, your love kept me safe. That's what I felt in the dreams." They arrived home to find Charles Edward preparing dinner, with Margaret helping and Robert playing with the dog they had recently adopted. "You're back," Charles Edward smiled. "How was the book launch?" "It was perfect," Emily replied. "Our story is finally complete." "It's not complete," Mason corrected. "It's just starting again, in an even better way." And he was right. That evening, as they all sat around the table Emily had bought specifically to fit their extended family, she realized their story truly was just beginning. The wounds of the past had healed, but hadn't disappeared. They had become part of the family's narrative of strength and resilience. Mason would grow up knowing he had been deeply loved by everyone around him, even in the hardest moments. Robert would continue his journey of redemption, proving every day that real change is possible. Margaret would remain the anchor of wisdom and stability that had held them all together when everything seemed lost. And Charles Edward would keep building his place in their unique family with patience and genuine love. Emily looked around the table and smiled. 5 years ago, she had been sitting on stone steps grieving the loss of her greatest joy. Now, she was surrounded by more love than she had ever imagined possible. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking our story proves miracles happen every day. Sometimes they look like kind children offering tissues to crying strangers. Sometimes they look like dreams that connect us to the ones we love. And sometimes they look like families who refuse to give up on each other, no matter how hard the road home may be. Do you think other people will have miracles like ours?" "I do, Mason, because I've learned that miracles aren't magical things that happen without explanation. Miracles are what happen when brave people refuse to give up on love." That night, after everyone had gone home and Mason was asleep, Emily sat on her porch and looked at the stars. For the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. Her son was safe in his bed, dreaming the sweet dreams of a beloved child. Her family, though untraditional, was strong and full of real love. Her career as a writer was flourishing, allowing her to help other families through her story. And most importantly, she had learned that true love really is stronger than any obstacle life can put in its way. The end. And what did you think of this heartwarming story of family reunion? Could you feel Emily's emotions as she discovered that kind boy was her own missing son? Leave a comment sharing which part moved you the most, and if you know any similar stories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more touching stories. Your participation means so much to us.